He signed the divorce papers without even looking up from his phone. Ethan Mercer slid the folder across the kitchen table like he was closing a deal on a losing stock. Efficient, emotionless, already mentally moved on. Claire stood across from him in her faded cardigan, holding a mug of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. He didn't notice. He never noticed. "I had legal draw up something fair," he said, finally glancing up. "You keep the car. I'll cover 3 months of rent while you get settled." He said it the way a man cancels a subscription, politely, impersonally, without a single moment of grief. Claire looked at him for a long time. Then she set down the mug, picked up the pen, and signed. No tears, no argument, no dramatic exit. She simply walked to the bedroom, packed one bag, left a folded note on the counter, and was gone before the elevator doors had closed behind her. Ethan stood alone in the apartment he'd spent 2 years curating, the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Elliott Bay, the Italian leather furniture, the custom kitchen he never cooked in, and felt nothing but relief. He had absolutely no idea what he had just thrown away. If you've ever watched someone destroy the best thing in their life while convinced they were making the smartest decision of it, drop a like and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Stay with me all the way to the end, because what happens to Ethan Mercer will stay with you long after the screen goes dark. The note Claire left had 5 words on it. "The empty canvas is yours." Ethan read it once, set it on the counter, and made himself a protein shake. He didn't think about it again for 3 weeks. Not until the morning, everything in his carefully constructed life began, very quietly, to come apart at the seams. But that came later. In those first weeks after Claire walked out the door, Ethan Mercer was the happiest he'd been in years, which tells you almost everything you need to know about the kind of man he was. He'd grown up in Tacoma in a house that smelled like cigarette smoke and overdue bills. His father worked freight logistics. His mother waitressed doubles on weekends. And Ethan had understood from a very young age that the distance between where he came from and where he wanted to go was measured in one currency: money. Not just comfort money, real money, the kind that changed the way people looked at you when you walked into a room. By 32, he had clawed himself most of the way there. Mercer Capital Partners occupied 4 floors of a glass tower in downtown Seattle, and Ethan's name appeared on the door of a corner office on the 31st floor. He managed portfolios for tech founders, real estate developers, and 2 minor celebrities whose business managers trusted him with more than they probably should have. He wore suits that cost more than his mother made in a month. He drove a car that turned heads. He worked 14-hour days and called it passion, when really it was something closer to hunger. The gnawing, restless kind that never quite gets full, no matter how much you feed it. He met Claire Rowan at a friend's wedding 6 years before the divorce. She'd been sitting at the edge of the reception dinner, drawing something in a small sketchbook while the speeches dragged on, completely unbothered by the noise around her. He'd been charmed, briefly, by her stillness. She was pretty in an understated way, dark hair pulled back, clear eyes, a laugh that surprised you with how genuine it sounded. She taught art at a middle school in the Beacon Hill neighborhood. She drove a 10-year-old Subaru. She thought a good Saturday meant a farmer's market and a new documentary. She was, by every metric Ethan used to measure the world, completely unremarkable, and yet he'd married her. He told himself later, during the long, self-justifying internal monologue that preceded the divorce, that he'd done it because he was young and still operating under the illusion that love was more important than alignment. That was the word he used with himself, alignment. He and Claire simply weren't aligned. She didn't understand his world. She didn't want to. She showed up to his firm's client dinners in flats when everyone else wore heels, made quiet jokes that went over people's heads, and once told a managing partner's wife that she thought most modern art galleries felt more like mausoleums than living spaces, which was both accurate and catastrophically ill-timed. She embarrassed him. He told himself it wasn't about embarrassment, but it was, mostly. The real fracture, though, the thing that split them open beyond any real repair, was Vanessa Cole. Ethan met Vanessa at the conference in San Francisco 18 months before the divorce. She was a VP of corporate strategy at a mid-sized tech firm, sharply dressed, relentlessly polished, the kind of woman who walked into networking receptions and immediately recalibrated the gravitational center of the room. She laughed at his jokes at exactly the right moments. She talked about quarterly projections the way other people talked about art, with feeling, with conviction, with the particular passion of someone who genuinely loved the game. He was back in Seattle for 2 days before he started emailing her. He told himself it was professional, a potential referral opportunity, a useful contact. He told himself that for 4 months. By month 5, he had stopped telling himself anything and had simply accepted that whatever was happening with Vanessa felt more real to him than anything waiting for him at home, which was a damning thing to realize, and which he managed by deciding it was Claire's fault for being, in some fundamental way, insufficient. He never said that word to her face. He didn't have to. She could feel it. "You used to talk to me," she said one night in February, sitting across from him at a dinner he'd come home 40 minutes late for and forgotten he'd promised to cook. "Not about work. About things. You used to tell me things." "I'm tired, Claire." "I know you're tired. I'm asking if you're okay." "I said I'm tired." She looked at him the way she sometimes did, like she was reading something written on him that he himself couldn't see, and then she got up and cleared the plates without saying anything else. He watched her move around the kitchen and felt shamefully impatient. She was so quiet, so contained. Everything about Claire existed at a volume that felt to him like standing still when the rest of the world was accelerating. Vanessa, by contrast, felt like motion, like forward momentum, like what winning was supposed to feel like. He filed the paperwork in March. He hadn't told Claire in advance. That was one of the things he hadn't fully anticipated, her reaction to the lack of warning. He'd expected anger or crying. He'd prepared in his private way for some version of the scene he'd watched play out in other people's marriages, accusations, thrown objects, lawyers, the ugly machinery of a contested separation. He'd braced for it the way you brace for a difficult earnings call, with documentation, with talking points, with the practiced neutrality of someone managing a situation rather than living inside one. What he got instead was 5 words on a folded piece of paper, and the particular devastating quality of Claire's silence. She didn't contest the settlement. She didn't ask for the apartment, or her share of his retirement accounts or spousal support. She took her personal belongings, her sketchbooks, 3 boxes of art supplies, and a photograph of the 2 of them from a camping trip in the Olympic Peninsula. The only photograph she took, which Ethan noticed only because it was the one where he wasn't looking at the camera. He was looking at her. He'd never noticed that before. His lawyer called the following Monday with an almost uncomfortable update. "She's accepted the terms as written. No negotiation, no counter. She signed everything." There was a pause. "I've been doing this for 19 years. People don't do that." "She's not complicated," Ethan said. "Right," his lawyer said, in a tone Ethan didn't examine. The divorce was finalized in 6 weeks. Claire Rowan, she'd already reverted to her maiden name before the ink was dry, disappeared from his life as cleanly as if she'd simply stepped out of frame. But Vanessa moved into the Elliott Bay apartment in April. She brought her own furniture, most of which was better than his, and within 3 weeks the space felt completely different, sharper, more intentional, the kind of curated minimalism that showed up in architecture magazines. She hung a single large abstract print above the fireplace, matte black frame, colors that managed to be both aggressive and controlled. Ethan stood looking at it one morning with his coffee and thought, this is what the apartment was always supposed to look like. He told Vanessa that. She smiled and kissed him and told him he had good taste for someone who'd been married to a middle school art teacher. He laughed. He shouldn't have, but he did. Work was better too. Or it felt that way in those early months. Having Vanessa in his corner meant access to her network, which was considerable, and she moved through Seattle's corporate ecosystem with an ease that opened doors Ethan had spent years trying to get through on his own. She knew everyone worth knowing and had a memory for names and connections that he genuinely admired. 2 of her introductions turned into clients. His managing partner, Douglas Hartley, pulled him aside in June and mentioned for the first time the word partnership, not as a certainty, but as a conversation worth having. Ethan went home that night and opened a bottle of wine that cost $400 and told himself that everything had worked out exactly the way it was supposed to. He believed it. He would believe it, with increasing effort, for the next several months. The first sign, not that he read it as a sign, came in July. He ran into a colleague named Marcus Webb at a lunch on Capitol Hill. Marcus was a portfolio manager at a different firm, someone Ethan knew from the circuit of networking events and charity functions that formed the connective tissue of their industry. They were waiting for a table when Marcus mentioned, almost casually, that he'd been approached about a new logistics company making noise in the investor space. Rowan Group, Marcus said, scanning the menu. Ever heard of it? Ethan went still. No, he said. What is it? Private family company, been operating quietly for decades. Intermodal freight, warehousing, some serious infrastructure holdings in the Pacific Northwest. The heir's been living under a media blackout while she was fulfilling some kind of inheritance condition. Word is she's about to go public with her identity. Whole thing's been handled through attorneys for the past 10 years. Marcus looked up from the menu. Apparently the woman's worth about $4 billion, give or take. Ethan stirred his water. Rowan, he said carefully, as if testing the weight of the word. Common enough name, Marcus said. Table for two? Whoa. He told himself it was a coincidence. He told himself that for 11 days, with the focused determination of a man refusing to look directly at something he was terrified to see clearly. He didn't look up the Rowan Group. He didn't search for Claire online. He was aware, on some suppressed level, that he was afraid of what he might find. But he packaged that fear as disinterest, the way he packaged most uncomfortable truths, and went back to work. But in the evenings, in the particular silence that always settled over the apartment after Vanessa fell asleep, he found himself thinking about the camping trip in the Olympic Peninsula, about the photograph Claire had taken, about how she'd never seemed to care about the things he cared about, the deals, the prestige, the constant forward motion, with a kind of serenity that he'd always read as limitation, as an absence of ambition. It occurred to him for the first time that he might have misread the signal, that what he'd called passive might have been patient, that what he'd called simple might have been something else entirely. He pushed the thought down. He was good at pushing thoughts down. He'd built an entire career on it. But that night, lying in the dark next to the woman he'd traded his marriage for, the 5 words on the folded note came back to him unbidden and stayed. The empty canvas is yours. He hadn't understood it at the time. He'd barely registered it. But lying there in the apartment that no longer felt like his, with its perfect furniture and its perfect angles and its $400 wine and its stranger's art, Ethan Mercer finally began to wonder what exactly Claire Rowan had meant, and what exactly she had known that he hadn't. The answer was closer than he thought, and far larger than anything he was prepared for. The invitation arrived on a Thursday, printed on paper so heavy it felt almost aggressive in Ethan's hand. The Pacific Northwest Philanthropic Alliance cordially invites you to the annual Legacy Gala, an evening celebrating vision, impact, and the future of American commerce. The Fairmont Olympic Hotel, Seattle. Saturday, October 14th. Black tie required. Douglas Hartley had handed it to him personally, which meant it mattered. Douglas didn't hand things to people personally unless he wanted them to understand the weight of the occasion without having to spell it out. Aldercott Logistics is going to be in that room, Douglas said, settling back into his chair with the particular ease of a man who had spent 30 years learning how to appear relaxed while being anything but. The whole executive team, new ownership transition in progress, and they need a wealth management partner they can trust with serious infrastructure assets. We're talking about a relationship worth north of $200 million in managed funds, Ethan. Maybe more if the transition goes the way people are expecting. Ethan looked at the invitation. Who's the new ownership? That's the interesting part. Douglas picked up his coffee. It's a family inheritance situation. Private. The attorneys have been running point for years while the heir fulfilled some kind of succession condition. They're announcing the official transition at the gala. Big reveal moment, apparently. The whole thing's been choreographed. Do we know who it is? We know it's a woman. We know she's been living quietly while the condition was in effect, which apparently included restrictions on public disclosure of her identity. Douglas set the cup down. What we know is that she's sophisticated, she's private, and she's about to control one of the largest privately held freight and logistics companies in the Pacific Northwest. He looked at Ethan steadily. Be in that room. Be memorable. And for the love of everything, don't bring Vanessa. Ethan almost asked why not. Then he thought about the managing partner's wife and the art gallery comment, and he understood. Well, he spent 2 weeks preparing for the gala the way he prepared for every high-stakes meeting, with the methodical, almost compulsive thoroughness of someone who understood that confidence was only reliable when it was backed by information. He pulled everything publicly available on Aldercott logistics, freight volume, infrastructure footprint, warehouse holdings across Washington, Oregon, and Idaho, a fleet operation that had been quietly expanding for a decade without attracting the kind of press attention that usually followed companies of its size. Whoever had been managing it had been deliberately keeping it out of the spotlight. That kind of deliberate invisibility cost money and required discipline. It also, Ethan knew, tended to indicate someone who understood the difference between being powerful and performing power. He noted that, filed it, kept preparing. Vanessa found him at the kitchen table at midnight on a Wednesday, surrounded by printouts and his second cup of cold coffee. "You're doing that thing again," she said, pouring herself a glass of water without turning on the overhead light. "What thing?" "The thing where you treat a dinner party like a military campaign." "It's not a dinner party. It's the most important introduction of my career." She looked at the papers spread across the table. "Do you know who she is yet? The heir?" "Not yet. Attorneys have kept it locked down tight." Vanessa sat across from him, pulling one of the documents toward her and scanning it with the quick, practiced eye he'd always found impressive. "Rowan Group," she said, reading a sidebar notation he'd made. "That name keeps appearing in the holding company filings." Ethan's hand went still on his coffee cup. "It's a common name," he said. Vanessa gave him a look that was hard to read in the low light. "You've said that before." He hadn't realized he'd said it to her at all, which meant the thought had been closer to the surface than he'd wanted to admit. "Get some sleep," Vanessa said. She set the document back down and went to bed. Ethan sat at the table for another hour, staring at the name in his own handwriting until the letters stopped looking like letters and started looking like something else entirely. The Fairmont Olympics main ballroom had been dressed for the occasion with the particular excess that Seattle's philanthropic circuit reserved for events, where everyone was simultaneously celebrating generosity and conducting business. Crystal chandeliers. Round tables set for 10 with centerpieces so tall they interfered with conversation, which Ethan had always suspected was the point. Force people to talk to the person next to them instead of across the table, increase the intimacy of the transaction. He arrived early, which was intentional. He positioned himself at the perimeter of the reception area where he could see the room without being easily cornered, nursing a club soda and cataloging faces. He found 2 members of the Aldercott executive team within the first 20 minutes, a CFO named Gerald Park, whom he'd researched extensively, and a VP of operations whose LinkedIn profile he'd memorized, and made his approach to both in the easy, unhurried way he'd spent years perfecting. Not selling, just existing in proximity, letting the conversation find its own shape. Gerald Park was more relaxed than Ethan expected, which was a good sign. He talked about the transition with the cautious enthusiasm of someone who had survived a period of uncertainty and could now see the other side. "It's been a strange few years," Gerald admitted, accepting a second glass of champagne from a passing server. "Running a company of this size with the ownership structure held entirely in trust, you can't make certain decisions, can't make certain commitments. Everything's subject to review." He paused. "But Ms. Rowan has made it very clear that she intends to operate with full authority and a long-term horizon. That's genuinely exciting for the team." Ethan's champagne glass was halfway to his mouth. He lowered it. "Ms. Rowan," he said, and his voice came out at exactly the right register. Mild, professionally curious, because he had spent the better part of a decade training himself to keep his face composed under conditions that called for panic. "She's the heir?" "Oh, I assumed you knew." Gerald glanced around, then back. "The announcement's in about an hour, so I'm not telling you anything that won't be public knowledge shortly. Claire Rowan. She's been... Well, you'll hear her story in her own words. But I'll say this much. She is not what anyone in that room is expecting." Ethan set his glass down on a passing tray because he no longer trusted his hand. "No," he said very quietly. "I don't imagine she is." He spent the next 45 minutes in a state that he would later have difficulty accurately describing. It wasn't quite panic. Panic implied uncertainty about outcomes, and some part of Ethan's mind, the cold analytical part that had made him very good at his job and a deeply compromised human being, had already begun processing the information with a clarity that felt like being slowly submerged in ice water. He moved through the ballroom on autopilot, shaking hands, exchanging cards, responding to questions with appropriate answers that his mouth produced independently of whatever was happening in the rest of him. Claire Rowan. Ms. Rowan. 10 years. Gerald had said 10 years. They'd been married for 6, which meant that when Claire had sat across from him at that camping trip in the Olympic Peninsula, packing lunches in the back of her 10-year-old Subaru and sketching in her small notebook and talking about her students with the kind of unguarded warmth he'd dismissed as small time, she had already been living inside a condition, already been fulfilling something, already been patient in a way that he had read as passivity, as simplicity, as the comfortable absence of larger aspirations. He thought about the apartment, the faded cardigan, the cold coffee, the farmers' markets, the documentary nights. He thought about the way she'd looked at him when he'd been impatient with her, that steady, undefended look, like she was seeing him very clearly and had decided to love him anyway. He gripped the back of an empty chair and stood very still for a moment. Then the lights in the ballroom shifted, a subtle dimming that indicated the program was beginning, and Ethan moved to his assigned table and sat down and put his hands flat on the tablecloth and waited. The foundation's board chairman made opening remarks that lasted 8 minutes and said very little, which was standard. 2 other executives spoke briefly about the year's philanthropic commitments. There was a film tribute to a recently retired board member, and then the chairman returned to the podium and said, "It is my genuine pleasure to introduce the new chief executive officer of the Rowan Group, a woman who spent a decade honoring a promise to her family while serving her community in ways that most of us will never fully know. Ladies and gentlemen, Claire Rowan." The applause started before she reached the stage. Ethan watched her walk out from the wings and felt something happen in his chest that he had no clean word for. She was wearing a deep navy dress, simply cut, nothing architectural about it, and her hair was down the way she used to wear it on weekends. Not the blowout that Vanessa wore to events, not the calculated softness of someone who'd spent an hour manufacturing effortlessness. Just her hair, dark, falling past her shoulders, exactly the way it had always looked. She wore no statement jewelry, small earrings, a watch that was understated enough to make every other watch in the room look like it was compensating for something. She looked like herself. That was the thing that hit him hardest. She looked entirely, precisely, unapologetically like herself. And the 300 people in that ballroom were watching her with the focused attention of people in the presence of someone who commanded rooms not by demanding it, but by simply being incapable of pretending to be smaller than she was. "Thank you," she said at the podium, and her voice was the same. Quiet, clear. The voice she'd used to tell him about her students, to read to him from books he never had the patience to sit still for. "I'll keep this brief, because the work matters more than the introduction." Light laughter. Warm. Real. She spoke for 12 minutes. She talked about her grandfather, who had built the first Rowan freight terminal in 1967 with 6 trucks and a lease on a warehouse in Tacoma. She talked about her father's vision for what the company could become. She talked about the decade she had spent teaching middle school art. And she did not present it as sacrifice or as something she'd endured. She presented it as something she had loved, and the honesty of that distinction was so sharp and so specific that it cut right through the formal atmosphere of the room and landed differently than anything the previous speakers had said. "I spent 10 years watching 12-year-olds discover that they were capable of making something beautiful," she said. "That's not a detour from running a company. That's probably the best education I could have gotten for it." More applause. Sustained this time. Ethan's hands were still flat on the tablecloth. At the table to his left, he heard a woman lean toward her companion and say, "She's extraordinary," in the hushed voice people used for things they hadn't anticipated and couldn't quite account for. He knew the feeling. Die Post. The dinner that followed was organized torture. He sat through 4 courses making conversation he couldn't have recalled 30 seconds after it ended, his attention fractured between the table and the other side of the room where Claire moved through the crowd with a composure he recognized. It was the same composure she'd brought to his firm's dinner parties, except that here no one read it as insufficient. Here it read exactly as what it was. He watched Gerald Park guide her from group to group. He watched the Aldercott executive team orbit her with the body language of people who were genuinely impressed rather than obligated. He watched her listen to people the way she'd always listened, fully, without checking the room over their shoulder, without performing attention. And he watched those people respond to being genuinely heard in the way people always respond to it. They softened, they leaned in, they trusted her without quite knowing why. He had called that quality unremarkable. He had called it a liability. He pushed his dessert plate aside and made his decision. He would approach her, not as her ex-husband, not with that weight on the table between them, but professionally, carefully, as an introduction in a room full of introductions. He would be composed, he would be measured, he would be, if nothing else, decent. He was on his feet, threading between tables when he saw her notice him. It was just a glance. Across 30 feet of ballroom, between 2 conversations, for no more than 2 seconds. But he had been married to her for 6 years, and he knew her face at a resolution that no amount of time had yet degraded. And what he saw in those 2 seconds was not surprise, not hurt, not the complicated, searching look he might have expected from someone encountering an unresolved wound in a public place. What he saw was recognition, and behind it, steady, unhurried, entirely private, something that might have been patience, like she'd been expecting this moment for a while, like she'd already decided what to do with it. She turned back to her conversation. She didn't look at him again. 20 seconds later, a hand appeared at Ethan's elbow, firm, professional. He turned. A man in a dark suit, fit, with the particular stillness of someone trained to be unobtrusive in expensive rooms. Security, but not the obvious kind. "Mr. Mercer," the man said, quietly enough that no one nearby could hear. "Ms. Rowan asks that you enjoy the remainder of the evening." A brief pause, precise as a period at the end of a sentence. At a different venue. Ethan looked at the man. Then he looked across the room at Claire, who was laughing at something the CFO had said. Genuinely laughing, head tilted slightly, the laugh he used to hear on Saturday mornings, and not looking at him at all. "She knew I was here," Ethan said. Not a question. "She's been aware of the guest list for some time," the man said. "Mr. Mercer, I'll walk you to the coat check." He didn't argue. There was nothing to argue against. He retrieved his coat, walked through the Fairmont's lobby, past the tall floral arrangements and the murmur of the crowd, and stepped out onto the sidewalk on University Street into the cold October air. He stood there for a long moment. The city moved around him the way cities do, indifferent, continuous, unbothered by any single person's reckoning. A cab moved through the intersection. A couple walked past arm in arm, talking about something that made them both smile. Somewhere nearby, the faint sound of music from a bar on the next block. He had come to that gala to win the most important account of his career. He had walked out of it escorted by Claire Rowan's security. He pulled out his phone. Vanessa had texted twice, once asking how it was going, once sending a photo of whatever she'd ordered for dinner. He looked at both messages for a while without responding. Then he put the phone in his pocket and stood on the sidewalk for another 5 minutes, thinking about a woman in a faded cardigan setting down a mug of cold coffee and picking up a pen without a single word of complaint. He had read that as weakness. He had been so profoundly, catastrophically wrong. The wind off Elliott Bay found its way between the buildings, and Ethan Mercer turned up his collar and started walking, though he couldn't have told you, in that moment, which direction he was headed or what he was walking toward. He only knew, with the specific, sickening clarity of someone who has just watched an entire story reassemble itself around him in a new and devastating shape, that the woman he had dismissed as ordinary had just, without raising her voice or changing her expression, reminded him of exactly what he was. He sent the first email on a Sunday. He wrote it carefully, 3 drafts across 2 hours, which was more time than he'd spent on most of the significant communications of his professional life. He kept it short. He kept it professional. He did not mention the gala or the security escort or the particular quality of the October air on University Street afterward. He said only that he understood she was in a period of significant transition, that he respected the demands on her time, and that he believed, if she was willing, a brief conversation might be of mutual value. He read it over one final time, changed one word, changed it back, and hit send. Her assistant responded in 48 hours. The email was brief, courteous, and gave nothing away. Miss Rowan appreciates your message. She will be in touch directly if she wishes to schedule a meeting. He waited. He sent a second email 10 days later. Slightly warmer in tone, slightly more personal. Careful not to cross into territory that could be read as inappropriate, but acknowledging, obliquely, that they had a history that made the professional conversation more complicated than it might otherwise be. He said he understood that. He said he hoped she could set it aside long enough to hear what he had to say. Her assistant responded in 24 hours this time. Miss Rowan has received your message. She will be in touch directly if she wishes to schedule a meeting. Word for word. Same sentence, same period at the end. Ethan stared at his screen for a while after that one. Meanwhile, at Mercer Capital Partners, things were moving in ways that he didn't yet understand were connected. Douglas Hartley had 2 follow-up conversations with the Aldercott executive team in the weeks after the gala, both of which had gone well by Douglas's account. Cautiously optimistic, exploratory, the normal texture of a long-lead business development process. Ethan had been looped in on both briefings and had contributed the right analysis at the right moments, and had given no indication that he had a prior relationship with the company's new CEO, because doing so would have required an explanation he had no clean way to deliver. He was managing information the way he always managed it, in silos, compartmentalized, each person knowing only what he decided they needed to know. It was the skill that had made him effective. It was also, though he hadn't recognized it yet, the central failure of his character. Vanessa noticed something was off. She always noticed. Her intelligence was sharp and socially calibrated in the way that made her valuable in boardrooms and occasionally exhausting to live with. She didn't ask direct questions, which was both a courtesy and a form of pressure. She simply watched him with an attentiveness he had once found flattering and now found slightly claustrophobic, and waited for him to explain himself. He didn't. "You've been somewhere else for 3 weeks," she said one evening, not looking up from her laptop. "Since the gala. Work is complicated right now." "It's always complicated. This is different." She closed the laptop. "Did something happen at the Fairmont that you're not telling me about?" He looked at her. He thought about telling her. He almost did. He got as far as forming the opening sentence in his head before something stopped him, some instinct he didn't fully examine, and he said instead, "I'm just focused on closing the Aldercott relationship. It's the most important thing on the table right now." She held his gaze for a moment, and then she opened the laptop again. "Okay," she said, in the voice she used when she meant something else entirely. 1. Claire's email arrived on a Wednesday morning at 7:14 before he'd left for the office. It was 3 sentences. "Ethan, I'll give you 30 minutes. My attorney's office, Friday at 2. Please don't be late." He read it 4 times. He noted the absence of pleasantries, the economy of language, the absence of his last name in the greeting. Just Ethan, dropped at the start like a stone into water. He noted that she'd chosen her attorney's office rather than her own. Neutral ground, technically, but surrounded by her infrastructure, her choice of terrain. He wrote back immediately, "Thank you. I'll be there." He spent Thursday preparing the way he always prepared, assembling materials, rehearsing frameworks, thinking through the angles. He told himself the objective was simple: establish a professional relationship that could survive their personal history long enough to have a real business conversation. That was all. One meeting, one foundation, and then they could move forward like adults who had an unfortunate past and a potentially productive future. He almost believed it. The attorney's office was in a building on 4th Avenue, 22 floors up, with a view of the Sound that probably cost extra in the lease. The waiting area had the careful neutrality of spaces designed to communicate competence without warmth. Gray upholstery, a low glass table, magazines no one ever read. Claire was already there when he arrived. Not in the waiting area. He was shown directly to a conference room, and she was seated at the far end of the table, a legal pad in front of her, and a cup of coffee at her right hand. Her attorney, a compact woman in her 50s named Sandra Lim, sat to her left. A second attorney Ethan didn't recognize sat to her right. No one was on Ethan's side of the table. He sat down. "Thank you for seeing me," he said. "You asked 3 times," Claire said. Not unkindly, just accurately. She looked well. That was the thing he noticed first and kept noticing. She looked rested in a way that had nothing to do with sleep and everything to do with the absence of sustained low-grade misery. He hadn't recognized, while he was the cause of it, how much tension she had carried in the set of her shoulders, the careful way she'd chosen her words around him. Without it, she seemed taller somehow, more fully occupying the space she was in. "How are you?" he asked. "I'm good, Ethan." She picked up her coffee. "You've got 30 minutes. He had prepared 3 different openings. In the room, facing her, he discarded all of them and said the first true thing that came to him. "I didn't know." A silence. "About the inheritance," he clarified. "About any of it. When I filed for divorce, I genuinely didn't know." Claire looked at him steadily. "I know you didn't," she said. "That's actually one of the few things I've never doubted about you." Something in his chest loosened slightly. "Then you know I'm not here trying to—" "I know exactly why you're here, Ethan." She set the cup down. "You're here because Aldercott is the most significant potential account your firm has had in years. Douglas Hartley has been making promises he needs you to help him keep, and you believe that your history with me is either an asset or a liability, depending on how this conversation goes." She glanced at the legal pad without writing anything on it. "Am I wrong?" He opened his mouth, closed it. "You're not entirely wrong," he said. "I respect that you said that instead of arguing." She folded her hands on the table. "So let me be equally direct. I have no interest in harming you personally, Ethan. What happened between us is finished. I signed those papers, and I meant what they signified." "Then there's a path. I'm not finished." Her voice didn't harden. It just became very clear, the way a room becomes clear when someone turns on all the lights at once. "I'm not interested in a business relationship with Mercer Capital Partners. I communicated that to my executive team before the gala. Gerald Park, who you spoke with at the Fairmont, was asked to conduct a preliminary assessment of all firms under consideration for our asset management transition. His recommendation, which I received the morning after the gala, was to move forward with Pinnacle Pacific Advisors." Ethan went still. Pinnacle Pacific was Mercer Capital's primary competitor, had been for 7 years. The rivalry was not friendly. "The recommendation was based entirely on fit and capability," Claire continued. "I want to be clear about that. I did not ask Gerald to exclude your firm because of our personal history. I asked him to evaluate all options independently, and that was his conclusion." "But you knew I knew you were likely to approach us, yes. I also knew that regardless of my personal feelings, I had a fiduciary obligation to my company and to the hundreds of employees whose livelihoods depend on sound decisions." She paused. "That's not punishment, Ethan. That's just business." "I believe you understand the distinction." He did understand it. That was almost worse. Sandra Lim, who had not moved or spoken since he entered the room, slid a document folder across the table. Ethan looked at it without touching it. "What is this?" "The asset transfer agreement," Claire said. "The Rowan Group's transition of all managed holdings to Pinnacle Pacific. It was signed yesterday. I wanted you to hear it from me rather than through the industry network, which I imagine will carry the news within a week." He looked at the folder. At her. At the folder again. $200 million in managed assets, he said quietly. Closer to 300 once the full transition is complete. The number landed in the room and just sat there. He had known, abstractly, that she was very wealthy. Gerald had said $4 billion at the gala, and Ethan had processed that figure the way you processed very large numbers, as a concept rather than a reality. But $300 million walking out of his firm's pipeline in a signed document across a conference room table was not a concept. It was a specific, quantified consequence that Douglas Hartley was going to feel in the marrow of his ambitions. "This will end the partnership conversation," Ethan said. "I imagine it will complicate things, yes." "Claire." I'm not doing this to you. Her voice was still even, still clear. I'm doing what is best for my company. You know as well as I do that if our positions were reversed, you would make the same decision. He did know that. He would have made that decision without blinking. Is there anything, he started. There's one more thing, she said. She glanced at Sandra Lim, who produced a second document, a single page this time, with a property header at the top that Ethan recognized after a moment with a slow, creeping sense of unreality. It was the address of Mercer Capital Partners building. The Rowan Group acquired that property 14 months ago as part of a commercial real estate portfolio consolidation, Claire said. The previous owner was a holding company that didn't publicize its sale. Your firm's lease comes up for renewal in March. He stared at the page. You own our building, he said. The Rowan Group holds the deed, yes. And the lease renewal will be evaluated by our commercial properties team on standard market terms. She met his eyes. I have not instructed them to take any particular action. I want to be clear about that also. He believed her, and he also understood, with the precise financial intelligence that had been his most reliable faculty for 15 years, that it didn't matter whether she instructed them or not. The knowledge that she held that deed, and that Douglas Hartley would learn she held it, and that the lease came due in March, that knowledge alone would do more damage to his position at the firm than almost anything else she could have said in this room. He sat back in his chair. He looked at Claire Rowan, his ex-wife, in her navy jacket, with her legal pad and her coffee, and her 2 attorneys and 300 years' worth of accumulated composure, and he felt something he had not expected to feel in this room. Not anger, not the particular indignation of someone who believes they're being wronged. Shame. Straightforward, unambiguous, nowhere to put it, shame. I treated you badly, he said. It came out before he'd decided to say it, which meant it was probably the most honest thing he'd said in the last 2 years. Claire looked at him for a long moment. Something moved across her face, not softening exactly, but a kind of acknowledgement, like she'd been waiting to see if he was capable of that sentence, and now she had her answer. You did, she said simply. I convinced myself you were the problem, that you were holding me back. He heard himself saying it and felt the inadequacy of the words even as he produced them. I was wrong about that. You weren't wrong that we were mismatched, she said, with a directness that surprised him. We were. Maybe we always were. But there's a difference between recognizing that a marriage isn't working and treating the person you married like an inconvenience you needed to dispose of efficiently. He didn't argue. There was no argument to make. The note, he said. The empty canvas. A beat. You finally thought about it, she said. I've been thinking about it for months. She was quiet for a moment. Outside, 40 floors below, the city continued its indifferent business. Traffic, ferries, the whole apparatus of a place that had no particular interest in the private reckonings of any single person within it. You always wanted a blank slate, she said finally. Something you could build from scratch, exactly the way you imagined it. No history, no complications, no one else's fingerprints on the vision. She looked at him without malice, which somehow made it worse. I just wanted you to know that I understood what you were choosing, and that I was letting you choose it. And you? He heard the roughness in his own voice and didn't try to smooth it. Were you okay? After? Something almost gentle crossed her face. I went back to my classroom on Monday, she said. I had a student who was working on a self-portrait. She kept painting over it because she couldn't get it to look the way she imagined it in her head. I sat with her for an hour and told her the painting was more interesting with the history in it, all the layers underneath, all the decisions you could faint beneath the surface if you looked. She paused. I was fine, Ethan. I had things to do. He nodded. He didn't trust himself with more words than that. Sandra Lim glanced at her watch with the trained subtlety of an attorney who understood how to end a meeting without appearing to end it. Ethan got the message. He gathered himself, picked up his jacket from the back of the chair, and stood. For what it's worth, he said, I think you'll run that company extraordinarily well. I know I will, Claire said. Not arrogance, just the same steady matter-of-factness she'd brought to everything. Take care of yourself, Ethan. He walked out of the conference room, through the gray waiting area, and into the elevator. He rode it down 22 floors alone. He was back at the office by 4. By 4:45, Douglas Hartley's assistant had called to request an urgent meeting. By 5:30, Ethan was sitting across from Douglas in the corner office, watching his managing partner's face work through a sequence of emotions that the man was too controlled to name out loud, but not quite controlled enough to hide. The Pinnacle Pacific news had already arrived. The industry moved fast when it wanted to. "You knew her," Douglas said. Not a question. "She was my wife," Ethan said. "We divorced 8 months ago." The silence that followed had a specific texture. The silence of someone reassessing every conversation they'd had with you for the last year and finding discrepancies they hadn't noticed at the time. "And you didn't think that was relevant information," Douglas said, "when I handed you the Aldercott relationship. I didn't know she was the heir until the gala." "But you knew at the gala." Douglas's voice was very quiet. The quietest voices in rooms were usually the ones worth paying attention to. "And you said nothing." "I was managing the situation." "You were managing—" Douglas stopped himself. He put both hands flat on his desk and looked at the middle distance for a moment. "The lease," he said finally. "You've heard. Sandra Lim's office sent over the property documentation 40 minutes ago. I don't know if that was Claire Rowan's instruction or standard practice, but either way, we are sitting in a building owned by the woman whose account you just lost us, and whose ex-husband has been managing the relationship since October without disclosing a material conflict of interest." Ethan said nothing. There was nothing to say that would have helped. "I need you to take some time away from the office," Douglas said. "Starting now. HR will be in contact." Ethan picked up his jacket for the second time that day and walked out of the 31st floor for the last time without cleaning his desk. Vanessa was waiting when he got home. She was sitting at the kitchen table. His kitchen table, the Italian marble one that had seemed so important when he picked it out, and she had her coat on, which told him the conversation that was about to happen had been decided before he arrived. "It's Claire," she said. Not a question either. Everyone, it seemed, was done asking questions. "Yes." "She's the Rowan Group heir." "Yes." Vanessa looked at him with an expression he recognized, the expression of someone doing rapid recalculation, running the updated numbers, checking the new figures against the old ones. He knew the look. He'd worn it himself many times, in many rooms. "You were married to a billionaire," she said. "I didn't know that." "But you knew something was off. At the gala. You've known for weeks." She stood up. "And you didn't tell me." "I was trying to figure out how to handle it." "You were compartmentalizing," she said, with a precision that was almost clinical. "The way you do with everything you don't know how to feel. You put it in a box and you close the lid and you keep moving." He didn't deny it. Vanessa picked up her bag from the chair beside her. "I'm going to stay with a friend for a while." "Vanessa." "I'm not angry," she said, and he believed her, which made it worse in its own particular way. I looked at you tonight, and I realized I don't actually know what's in any of the boxes." She met his eyes. "And I think I need to find someone where that's not the starting condition." She left. He stood in the apartment, the perfect apartment, the curated apartment, the apartment he had selected as evidence of exactly the kind of man he intended to be, and listened to the sound of it being too quiet, and thought about a woman in a conference room 22 floors above the city, telling him that the painting was more interesting with the history in it, all the layers underneath, all the decisions you could see beneath the surface if you looked. He looked around the room, at the abstract print above the fireplace, Vanessa's, which meant it would be gone, at the furniture, at the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the water, the view he'd paid so much for and looked out of so rarely because there was always something on the screen that needed his attention more. The empty canvas is yours. He finally understood what she'd meant. She hadn't been wishing him well. She hadn't been delivering a parting kindness. She'd been telling him the truth about himself with the precision of someone who had studied him for years and arrived at a conclusion he wouldn't be ready to hear until he was standing exactly where he was standing right now. He had wanted a blank slate. He had gotten one. and there was nothing on it that he was proud of. The apartment sold in 11 days. He didn't fight for it. There was nothing to fight. The lease was in his name. The furniture was largely Vanessa's, and the abstract print above the fireplace had disappeared along with her by the following Tuesday, leaving a pale rectangle on the wall where it had hung, a ghost of an absence inside a larger absence. He walked through the stripped rooms one last time before handing over the keys and felt almost nothing, which worried him less than it probably should have. He found a one-bedroom in the Rainier Valley, third floor of a building that smelled like other people's cooking and had a parking situation that required strategy, and moved in with what fit in his car plus 3 boxes he shipped from a storage facility. The bed was new. Everything else was not much of anything. He set up the kitchen first because that was practical, then the desk by the window because he still had the instinct, even then, to establish a workspace before establishing a life. The desk looked out over a narrow street with a Korean grocery on the corner and a laundromat 2 doors down. Not Elliott Bay, not floor-to-ceiling glass, just a street doing its ordinary business, indifferent and continuous, the way streets are. He sat at the desk on the first night with nothing open in front of him and no calls to return, and stayed there for a long time. All right. The professional fallout moved faster than he'd anticipated, which was saying something because he'd anticipated it moving fast. Douglas Hartley had placed him on indefinite administrative leave by the end of November, and the formal separation from Mercer Capital Partners was complete before Christmas. The language in the separation agreement was careful: mutual decision, restructuring of responsibilities, the standard vocabulary of an industry that preferred euphemism to honesty, even when everyone in the room understood exactly what had happened. Ethan signed it without negotiating. He had leverage he chose not to use, which surprised his attorney and, in some quieter way, surprised himself. He called 3 firms in January. 2 did not return the calls. The third returned his call, but the conversation lasted 9 minutes and ended with the kind of polished regret that meant no without having to say it. The financial industry in Seattle was not large enough for a story like his to stay contained, and stories that involved a conflict of interest. With a woman who now controlled one of the region's most significant private fortunes did not stay contained for long. By February, he had been on precisely 4 interviews, all of which had the same quality: genuine initial interest, a specific moment somewhere in the second half of the conversation when the interviewer checked something on the screen in front of them or received a message, and then a perceptible cooling in the room temperature that no one named out loud. He drove home from each of them through Seattle's gray winter rain and sat in the parking situation that required strategy and stared at the steering wheel for a while before going upstairs. He was not broke. He had savings, carefully managed, ironic, given the circumstances, and his personal investment accounts were disciplined enough to keep him comfortable for a meaningful stretch of time. He was not destitute. He was not in danger. What he was invisible. For a man who had spent 15 years carefully constructing a particular kind of visibility, the right table at the right restaurant, the right mention in the right conversation, the right zip code, and the right vehicle in the right position on the masthead, invisibility was its own specific terror, not because of what it cost him materially, but because of what it revealed. Strip away the table and the mention and the masthead, and what was actually there? He spent a lot of time in February not answering that question. The job listing appeared in March, in a place he wasn't looking. He'd been in the Rainier Valley branch of the public library. His internet had been spotty for 2 days, and he'd needed somewhere quiet with reliable Wi-Fi. And he'd been working through a spreadsheet of potential contacts in the Pacific Northwest financial sector, when the man at the table next to him, somewhere in his 70s, unfolded a community newsletter and smoothed it open on the table with the deliberate care of someone who still valued printed things. Ethan wasn't paying attention. Then a phrase at the top of a column caught his peripheral vision. Cascade Community Credit Union, seeking financial counseling coordinator. He looked back at his spreadsheet. He looked at the newsletter again. He took out his phone and found the listing in about 40 seconds. Entry-level adjacent. Fixed salary that was less than he'd spent annually on suits at his previous income level. Primary responsibilities included one-on-one financial counseling with members facing debt restructuring, foreclosure navigation, small business loan applications, and household budget planning. He put the phone down. He picked it up again. He applied at 11:30 that night, sitting at the desk overlooking the Korean grocery, with a cover letter that went through 4 drafts before he arrived at something that was honest in a way his previous professional materials had never been. He didn't oversell. He didn't position. He said he had significant experience in financial analysis, that he had made serious mistakes in his professional life, that he understood money in ways that had previously served his own interests exclusively, and that he wanted to try using that understanding differently. He didn't expect to hear back. He heard back in a week. The interview was conducted by a woman named Patricia Shen, who ran the Cascade Community Credit Union with the no-theater efficiency of someone who had spent 30 years watching financial institutions overcomplicate their core purpose. She was somewhere in her early 60s, wore reading glasses on a beaded chain, and had a handshake that conveyed she had assessed him before he sat down. She looked at his resume for approximately 90 seconds. "Mercer Capital Partners," she said. "You left in December." "I was asked to leave," he said. "I'd rather say that plainly than dress it up." She looked up. "Why were you asked to leave?" "Conflict of interest involving a client relationship. I didn't disclose relevant information when I should have." He kept his voice even. "The decision to let me go was reasonable given the circumstances." Patricia Shen looked at him for a moment. "The people who come in here," she said, "are not wealthy. They're not close to wealthy. They're people who got behind on their mortgage by 1 bad month and are terrified of losing their house. People who took out a payday loan to cover a car repair and have been drowning in the interest ever since. People who have never had anyone explain a credit report to them in language they could actually understand." She set the resume down. "What makes you think you can help those people? Not talk down to them, not make them feel stupid for being in the situation they're in. Actually, help them." He thought about that for a moment, rather than reaching for the nearest polished answer. "I grew up in a house that was always worried about money," he said. "My father worked freight. My mother waitressed. I know exactly what it feels like to sit at a kitchen table with bills spread out, and not enough to cover all of them." He paused. "I spent the last 15 years helping people who didn't need help become richer. I was good at it. I'd like to find out if I'm good at the other direction." Patricia Shen picked up her glasses and put them back on. "We'll do a 30-day trial," she said. "The salary isn't negotiable. The hours aren't glamorous. If after 30 days you've decided this isn't for you, no hard feelings." "And if you've decided I'm not for you?" he asked. "Same answer," she said. He started the following Monday. The first week was humbling in ways he hadn't predicted and couldn't have prepared for. The Cascade Credit Union operated out of a 2-story building in a commercial strip between a Vietnamese sandwich shop and a tire repair place. The lobby had fluorescent lighting and chairs upholstered in a color that might once have been teal and laminated signs in 4 languages. His office, which he shared with a rotating cast of 2 other counselors, had a desk, 2 chairs for clients across from it, a telephone that rang more than felt possible for its size, and a window that looked at a concrete wall. He sat across from his first client on a Tuesday morning, a 47-year-old man named Dennis Kowalski who drove a school bus, had 3 kids in middle school, and had fallen behind on his home equity line of credit after his wife's surgery. The previous year had eaten through their savings and then some. Dennis had a folder of documents that he set on the desk between them with the careful embarrassment of someone presenting evidence of their own failure. Ethan looked at the documents. Then he looked at Dennis. "Can you walk me through what happened?" he said. "Just from the beginning. Don't worry about the order." Dennis looked at him for a second, like he'd expected something else, a form to fill out maybe, or a question about his credit score. Then he started talking. He talked for 25 minutes. Ethan listened. Actually listened. Not waiting for his turn to speak listened, but the kind where you're tracking the through line and the emotional logic as much as the facts, and asked 3 questions and wrote things down in a legal pad and did not once check his phone. By the end of it, he'd mapped out a restructuring approach that he believed had a realistic chance of working, contingent on 2 factors he needed to verify with the loan department. He told Dennis that clearly, without softening it into false comfort. "So there's a way out," Dennis said. Not quite a question. There's a path that might be a way out, Ethan said. I don't want to promise you more than I can deliver, but I think it's worth pursuing, and I'll be here to work through it with you. Dennis picked up his folder. He stood up and extended his hand, and when Ethan shook it, the grip had a quality that was different from every handshake he'd exchanged in 15 years of finance. Heavier somehow, more weight in it, the weight of something that actually mattered to the person doing the shaking. Thank you, Dennis said. I mean that. Ethan drove home that evening and sat at the desk by the window and thought about that handshake for a long time. The 30-day trial became permanent employment in early April. Patricia Shen mentioned it at the end of a staff meeting in the same tone she used for everything, matter of fact, no ceremony, and moved on to the next agenda item. Ethan nodded and wrote something on his notepad and felt something he couldn't immediately name. It took him a few days to identify it as gratitude, which he recognized partly because it was an emotion he'd so rarely encountered in himself that he'd somewhat lost the ability to recognize it on contact. The work was nothing like what he'd done before, and everything about the difference turned out to matter. At Mercer Capital, success was abstract. Numbers on screens, percentages, the compression of human need into performance metrics. The people whose money he managed were, in his daily reality, portfolios. They had names technically, but what he tracked was their yield, their exposure, their risk tolerance. The human being behind the account was largely incidental to the transaction. The cascade, the human being, was the entire transaction. He counseled a recently widowed woman in her 60s named Roberta, who had never handled the household finances herself and was discovering, at the worst possible moment, that her husband had been carrying a level of credit card debt she hadn't known existed. She came in frightened and left, over 4 sessions, with a plan she understood and had helped build. On her last visit, she brought in a tin of cookies she'd baked herself and set it on the desk and said, I haven't baked since James died. I think I needed to have something to do again. He counseled a 26-year-old named Miguel who had a small landscaping business, 2 employees, and a loan structure that was slowly eating his profit margin. Miguel was defensive in the first meeting, braced for condescension, which Ethan guessed he'd received plenty of, and opened up incrementally as he understood that Ethan was working the problem rather than performing a service. By the 3rd meeting, they were talking about a 5-year business plan that had Miguel leaning forward over the desk with the focused energy of someone who could see a future he hadn't been able to see before. He counseled a couple, late 30s, 2 kids, underwater on a house they'd bought at the wrong moment in the market cycle, who sat across from him holding hands on the desktop in the unconscious way of people who had decided to face a hard thing together. He gave them the honest version, the timeline, the difficulty, the specific steps, the places where it could still go sideways. He didn't cushion it. He'd learned that the people who came into that office had usually already been living with the unspoken version of the worst case. They didn't need protection from honest information. They needed someone to say it clearly so they could actually plan around it. The couple left without holding hands anymore. They were each carrying a stack of paperwork. But at the door, the woman turned back and said, No one's ever just told us the truth before. Everyone keeps trying to make it sound better than it is. She paused. That actually helps more. Ethan thought about that on the drive home, about what it meant that telling people the truth, plainly and without decoration, was remarkable enough to comment on. He was not good at the job immediately. That was the honest version, and he'd become more committed to honest versions. He overcomplicated his early explanations, defaulting to the vocabulary of his previous life, language calibrated for clients who had MBAs and wanted the technical texture. He had to learn, over weeks of practice and several moments of watching a client's face go politely blank, to translate, to find the plain version of every concept, to check, genuinely rather than rhetorically, whether the person across from him was following, to sit with the discomfort of silence while someone worked through a number that meant something to them, rather than filling the silence with more information. Patricia Shen observed 2 of his early client sessions from the adjacent desk, something she did with all new counselors, she told him, not a special accommodation, and her feedback afterward was delivered with the same direct efficiency she brought to everything. You explain things like you're defending them, she said, like you're expecting the client to challenge your analysis. Old habit, he said. Work on it. These people are not challenging your expertise, they're trusting it. There's a difference in how that needs to land. He worked on it. He also developed, over months, an understanding of the particular financial pressures that concentrated in that neighborhood and that demographic that no amount of managing wealthy portfolios had given him access to. The specific mathematics of living paycheck close, where a single unexpected expense, a car repair, a medical bill, a week of missed work, could cascade into a crisis with a speed that people operating with financial cushion literally could not imagine. He'd known the concept. He hadn't known the texture of it, the specific human weight of it, until he was sitting across from people who were living inside it. He started bringing that texture into his sessions. Not as performance of empathy. He'd watched other counselors do that, and it read as false, and the clients knew it, but as actual information. I understand that this number feels impossible right now, because I've watched it feel impossible to people whose situations look just like yours, and here's what that meant for how we approached it. It was, he recognized slowly, the most useful thing he'd been able to do with 15 years of financial knowledge. Not the most prestigious, not the most lucrative, the most useful. He ran into Marcus Webb in August at a coffee shop on Capitol Hill. Marcus was on his way somewhere, laptop bag over his shoulder, the quick, purposeful walk of someone midday. He stopped when he saw Ethan with the slight hesitation of someone deciding whether the social calculation came out in favor of acknowledgement. He decided yes, apparently, because he stopped. "Ethan," he said, "I heard you left Mercer." "Last December," Ethan said. A pause. The specific pause of someone trying to identify the right question. "What are you doing now?" "Financial counseling," Ethan said. "Community credit union in Rainier Valley." Marcus's face did something complicated, moving through several rapid recalibrations that he mostly managed to keep subtle. "That's okay," he said. "How is it?" Ethan thought about Dennis Kowalski's handshake, about Roberta's cookies, about the couple at the door saying no one had ever just told them the truth. "It's the best work I've ever done," he said. He meant it plainly, with no irony in it, which seemed to be the thing Marcus found hardest to process. They talked for another 5 minutes, the comfortable, vaguely disconnected conversation of people whose shared context had mostly evaporated. And then Marcus checked his watch and said he had to run. "Take care of yourself," he said, and moved off down the block. Ethan finished his coffee and walked back to his car. He had 2 client sessions that afternoon, a young woman navigating her first small business license, and a retired postal worker trying to understand the terms of a reverse mortgage his son had been pressuring him to sign. Both of them needed his full attention. He drove back to the credit union thinking not about Marcus Webb or Mercer Capital or the corner office on the 31st floor, but about the postal worker, whose name was Albert, and what questions Albert was most likely to have, and how to answer them in language that made Albert feel informed rather than managed. The months gathered into a year, then longer. The neighborhood became familiar in the granular way that places become familiar when you actually live inside them rather than passing through. The owner of the Korean grocery, who remembered that he liked the spicy rice cakes and set one aside for him on Fridays. The sound the building's elevator made that meant it was going to take 2 tries. The particular angle of afternoon light through the office window that arrived in October and turned the concrete wall outside briefly, unexpectedly golden. His apartment, which he'd moved into as a temporary arrangement and somehow stopped leaving, started to look inhabited. He bought a coffee table he'd assembled himself, badly, with one leg slightly shorter than the others. He hung 3 things on the walls, 2 prints he liked, and a photograph from a camping trip in the Olympic Peninsula, the one where he wasn't looking at the camera. He was looking at Claire. He left it up. Not as grief, or as longing, or as the particular self-punishment of someone who'd made a mistake and needed the visual reminder. He left it up because it was the one photograph in his possession where his face was doing something he was only now, at this particular stage of his life, learning to do reliably. He was paying attention to another person. He was actually there. It had taken losing everything he'd built to understand what that meant. He was not glad he'd lost it, exactly. He wasn't interested in the kind of reductive story where suffering was the point rather than the cost. But he understood, in a way that had weight to it now rather than just words, that the man in that photograph had been capable of more than the man who'd signed the divorce papers without looking up from his phone, and that the distance between those two versions of himself was the most important work he had ever done. He was not done with it yet. He was not sure he would ever be fully done with it. But sitting at the desk by the window on a Tuesday evening in October, with his notes from the day spread in front of him and the sound of the street below and the Korean groceries lights coming on in the early dark, he thought about Albert the postal worker, who had left that afternoon's session with the reverse mortgage documents clearly explained and a list of questions to ask his son, and something different in his posture than he'd arrived with. Something that looked, if you were paying attention, like a man who had recovered a little of his own agency. And Ethan Mercer, for the first time in longer than he could honestly remember, felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The proposal had taken him 4 months to build. Not 4 months of working on it occasionally, in the gaps between other things. 4 months of actual sustained work, the kind he hadn't given to anything since the years when he was hungry enough to stay at his desk until the cleaning crew came through. He pulled data from the neighborhoods he knew, now not as zip codes on a demographic report, but as actual places with actual textures, the concentration of predatory lending storefronts on certain blocks, the specific gap in financial education resources for first-generation small business owners, the pattern he'd watched repeat itself across 3 years of client sessions, where the same preventable mistakes destroyed the same types of households, because nobody had ever sat with those families early enough to show them the mechanics before the mechanics became a crisis. He built the case the way he used to build investment proposals, with numbers, with projections, with the disciplined logic of someone who understood that passion alone didn't move rooms, that you needed the architecture of evidence behind it. But he also built it with something his old proposals had never contained: specific people. Not demographics, not market segments. Dennis Kowalski, Roberta with her tin of cookies, Miguel and his landscaping business, Albert the postal worker who'd nearly signed away his house because his son had been impatient with his questions. He put those people in the proposal, anonymized, with permission sought and granted, because he'd learned in 3 years behind the desk at Cascade that the most powerful thing you could show a room full of decision-makers was the human cost of the problem they were being asked to solve. The Merritt Family Foundation had been funding community financial initiatives across the Pacific Northwest for 11 years. Their annual grant cycle included a category for scalable financial literacy and counseling programs, maximum award $2 million, with a stated preference for proposals that demonstrated measurable community impact and organizational capacity to deploy funds effectively. Patricia Shen had found the listing. She had walked into his office on a Thursday morning, set a printed page on his desk, and said, "This has your name on it," and walked back out without further elaboration, which was as effusive as Patricia got. He'd submitted the letter of intent in January, the full application in March. The invitation to present before the Foundation's grant committee arrived in April, and when he opened the email in the break room at Cascade, he sat very still for a full minute before he called Patricia's extension. "We made the finalist round," he said when she picked up. A pause. "I know," she said. "I got the same email." "Patricia, this is $2 million for the program, for the families." "I'm aware of what $2 million is, Ethan," but he could hear something underneath the dry delivery, something that might, on a different person, have been called excitement. "Don't blow the presentation." He spent 3 weeks preparing for 30 minutes in front of a committee. He ran the presentation in the Cascade conference room, a room that held 6 people comfortably and 8 with some negotiation, in front of Patricia and 2 colleagues who asked hard questions and didn't soften their feedback. He revised the deck twice. He cut 12 slides that he loved, and that were, as Patricia correctly identified, about demonstrating his own sophistication rather than communicating the program's value. "Who's the slide for?" she asked, pointing at a particularly dense financial modeling section he'd been privately proud of. He looked at it. "Me," he admitted. "Cut it." He cut it. Bam. The Merritt Family Foundation operated out of a converted warehouse in the South Lake Union neighborhood that had been renovated with the restrained elegance of an organization that took seriously the optics of spending philanthropic dollars on its own surroundings. Exposed brick, good light, serious art on the walls that managed not to feel like a statement. The conference room where finalist presentations were held seated 20 people around a long oval table, with the committee arranged on one side and the presenter at the far end, which was either democratizing or slightly gladiatorial, depending on how you looked at it. Ethan arrived 20 minutes early. He set up the presentation, checked the connection twice, poured himself a glass of water from the pitcher on the credenza, and did not drink it. He stood at the window and looked at the street below and thought, briefly and without particular drama, about the last time he had prepared this carefully for a room, the Fairmont Gala, October 2.5 years ago, when he'd walked in intending to win an account and walked out escorted by security. He was a different person now than the man who'd stood on University Street in the October cold trying to understand what had just happened to him. He knew that because the preparations he'd made for this room were not about what the room could give him. They were about what he could give the families who would never sit in it. The committee filed in at 9 o'clock. Ethan looked up as they settled into their chairs and found, with a jolt that moved through him cleanly and then stilled, that the woman at the center of the committee side of the table was Claire. He hadn't known. He'd researched the Merit Foundation thoroughly, their funding history, their priorities, their committee structure, and he'd found reference to a newly appointed chair of the Grants Committee, named 18 months earlier, but the name in the Foundation's materials was listed by initial and surname, C. Rowan. He'd seen that name and not let himself follow the thought to its obvious conclusion, whether that was denial or superstition or some form of unconscious self-protection, he couldn't have said. But he hadn't followed it. And so here they were. She saw him at the same moment he saw her. Her expression did not change. The same quality of composure he'd watched command a ballroom 2.5 years ago. But her eyes stayed on him for exactly one beat longer than they moved to anyone else in the room. And that single beat told him she was no more prepared for this specific morning than he was. The committee chair, a man in his 60s named Harold Merritt, whose grandfather had founded the organization, welcomed Ethan and introduced the committee members. When he reached Claire, he said, "And our grants committee chair, Claire Rowan, who joined our board 18 months ago and has brought an extraordinary clarity of vision to our funding priorities." "Good morning," Claire said to the room, and then specifically to Ethan. "Mr. Mercer, thank you for being here." "Thank you for having me," he said, and his voice was level, and he meant it without complication. He gave the presentation. He had given it enough times in the Cascade conference room that the mechanics were reliable, which freed the part of his attention that wasn't running the deck to be genuinely present in the room, watching the committee's faces, tracking where they leaned forward and where they wrote things down and where they exchanged the small glances that meant a point had landed. He talked about the gap in the existing service infrastructure. He talked about the specific mechanisms through which financial illiteracy compounded into generational poverty in exactly the neighborhoods Cascade served. He talked about what a funded expansion of the program could do, not in abstractions, but in projected case volume, in counselor capacity, in the concrete number of families who would have access to one-on-one support they currently had no pathway to reach. And then he talked about Dennis and Roberta and Miguel and Albert. He talked about them with the specificity of someone who had sat across from them for hours and understood not just their financial situations, but the particular shame and fear that attached to those situations. The way people apologized for their own circumstances, the way they braced for judgment, the way they visibly relaxed when they understood that the person across from them was not there to evaluate them, but to actually help. He talked about what it had cost those families to walk through that door, and what it had meant to them to walk out of it with something they hadn't had before, not money usually, but clarity, agency, the specific relief of understanding their own situation fully enough to make real decisions about it. He talked about it like a man who had done the work, because he had done the work. When he finished, Harold Merritt asked 3 questions about organizational capacity and fund deployment timelines. 2 other committee members asked about measurable outcomes and partnership structures. The questions were substantive, and Ethan answered them directly, acknowledging the 2 areas where the program's current data was thinner than he'd like, and explaining specifically how the grant funding would address those gaps. Then Harold said, "Claire, did you have questions for Mr. Mercer?" She had been quiet through the presentation. not inattentively. He'd been aware of her attention throughout, the particular quality of it, that full room listening he'd watched other people respond to at the gala. She'd written things on the notepad in front of her without looking down at it, the habit of someone who didn't want to break eye contact to take notes. She looked at him now. "I have one question," she said. "Not about the program. About you." A pause, the briefest one. "Why this work? You had a specific career trajectory, specific expertise, a specific professional community. You walked away from all of it to counsel families at a community credit union. I'd like to understand, in your own words, not the application language, what that actually means to you." The room was quiet. He had not prepared for this question, which was, he suspected, precisely why she'd asked it. He thought about Dennis Kowalski's handshake. He thought about Albert the postal worker and the reverse mortgage, and the way Albert's shoulders had changed between walking in and walking out. He thought about sitting at the desk in the Rainier Valley apartment on the first night with nothing in front of him and the empty rectangle on the wall where Vanessa's print had been, and 5 words on a folded piece of paper that had taken him 2 years to understand. "I spent 15 years being very good at making wealthy people wealthier," he said. "I was technically skilled. I worked hard. I also, and I'm not going to dress this up, I cared about the wrong things. The status of the client, the size of the account, what managing certain portfolios said about me." He kept his eyes on her. "I made decisions in my personal life that reflected those priorities, and I lost things that mattered more than anything I thought I was gaining." No one in the room moved. The families who come into Cascade aren't there because they were careless or irresponsible. Most of them are there because one bad thing happened, or because no one ever explained to them how certain financial systems worked until they were already caught inside them. And they come in ashamed. That's the thing I wasn't prepared for. The shame. People apologizing for needing help understanding something they were never taught. He paused. "I understand something about that now, about being in a situation you didn't entirely see coming, and having to figure out who you actually are when there's nothing left to hide behind." He stopped himself there. That was as far as he was willing to go in a committee room, and it was further than he'd planned to go at all. Claire held his gaze for a moment. Then she wrote something on her notepad and said, "Thank you, Mr. Mercer." Harold Merritt thanked him for his time. Ethan packed his presentation materials, shook hands around the table, and left. He walked to his car and sat in it for 10 minutes without starting the engine. He had not come to that room for Claire. He needed to be clear about that with himself. And the proposal was real. The work behind it was real. The families it would serve were real. And none of that had anything to do with who was sitting at the center of the committee table. But her question had pulled something out of him that he hadn't planned to say in that room. And he sat with the rawness of it, the way you sit with the rawness of having said a true thing out loud in front of witnesses. He drove back to Cascade. He had a session at 11 with a young couple trying to navigate student loan consolidation, and Patricia needed the updated program budget by end of day. He sat at the desk and opened his files and did the work because the work was there and the families were real, and that was, he had learned, the most reliable way through any given day. Posto. The call came on a Friday, 3 weeks later. Harold Merritt's assistant reached him on his cell at 2:15. The committee had concluded its deliberations. The Merritt Family Foundation was pleased to offer the Cascade Community Credit Union Financial Counseling Expansion Program a grant award of $2,200,000, representing the maximum award plus a supplemental allocation approved by the full board. He was standing in the Cascade parking lot when the call came. He thanked Harold's assistant with the composure of someone who had practiced composure under conditions that called for other things, and then he hung up and stood in the parking lot for a moment with the phone in his hand. He went inside. He walked to Patricia's office and stood in the doorway. She was on a call. She looked up. She read his face. She held up one finger, one moment, and finished her call in 45 seconds flat and hung up. "How much?" she said. 2.2, he said. "Full board supplemental." Patricia Shen, who he had never seen express anything more demonstrative than a single nod of approval, stood up from her desk and said, "Well, and then sat back down and picked up her phone and began making calls. He went back to his desk. He had a session at 3. The email from Claire arrived that evening after he was home. It was longer than anything she'd sent him before, longer than the 3-sentence meeting invitation 2.5 years ago, longer than anything in the spare professional register her attorneys and assistants had maintained on her behalf. It was 3 paragraphs, and she had written it herself. He could tell, the way you could tell the difference between a person's actual voice and something produced on their behalf. She said the committee's decision had been unanimous. She said the supplemental allocation had been her recommendation to the full board, and that it had been based entirely on the quality of the proposal and the clarity of the need it addressed. She said she wanted him to know that because she thought he deserved to understand that it was not charity and not complication. It was a grant to a program that had earned it. Then she wrote, "I watched you in that room this morning, and I want to say something I may not have another opportunity to say. I'm not someone who spends time on regret. What happened between us happened, and I made my peace with it a long time ago. But I want you to know that the man who presented today is not the man I was married to. I don't mean that as a wound. I mean it as an acknowledgement. What you've built in that credit union and what you said about the people you serve, that mattered. It was true. I've sat through enough presentations in the last 3 years to know the difference. I hope the work goes well. I believe it will." He read it twice. Then he set the phone down on the desk. The same window, the same street below with the Korean grocery and the laundromat. And he sat with it. There was a version of this moment, in a different story, where he would have written back immediately with something that reopened a door, that reached toward the possibility of something more, that tried to convert her acknowledgement into an invitation. He knew that version of himself. He had been that version. The one who always angled toward a better position, who read every opening as an opportunity to improve his situation. He was not that version tonight. He wrote back. He kept it short. "Claire, thank you. For this and for the meeting 2 years ago, and for the way you handled everything with a dignity I didn't come close to earning. I'm not going to pretend I don't have regrets, because I do. And they're specific and they're mine to carry. But I'm grateful you could see what this work is. That means something to me. I hope the company is everything your grandfather worked for it to become. I think it probably is." He didn't say anything else. He sent it and closed the laptop and made himself dinner, pasta, nothing complicated, and ate it at the kitchen table that wasn't Italian marble, on a chair that didn't match the table, in an apartment in the Rainier Valley with its slightly imperfect silence and its smell of other people's cooking and its view of a street doing its ordinary business. He never heard from her again after that, not in anger, not as distance, just as the natural settling of 2 lives that had intersected and then diverged and found their separate shapes. He thought about her sometimes, the way you thought about people who had been formative in your understanding of yourself. Not with longing, exactly, but with a kind of permanent attention. He followed the Rowan Group's public reporting and watched it expand steadily under her direction into markets that would have surprised everyone who hadn't been paying careful attention to what she was. He suspected she ran it the way she'd run everything, with patience, with precision, with the particular stubbornness of someone who understood that the long view was the only view worth taking. He hoped she was happy. He believed she was. As for himself, he was not going to tell you that he arrived, cleanly and completely, at some finished version of a better man. That was not how it worked, and he knew it better than most. He still had the instincts of the person he'd been. The cold calculation, the instinct to manage rather than connect, the reflexive reach for positioning when he felt uncertain. He caught those instincts more reliably now. He didn't always catch them in time. He was a work in progress who had stopped pretending otherwise, which was its own quiet form of progress. The Cascade expansion launched in the spring, with the merit grant funding 2 additional counselors, a dedicated small business advising program, and a financial literacy curriculum that Patricia had spent 4 months developing with input from every counselor on staff, including Ethan, whose section on debt restructuring was, according to the first cohort of participants, actually understandable, which he accepted as the highest professional compliment of his life. He was 41 years old. He drove a sensible car. He lived in an apartment with a slightly lopsided coffee table and 3 things on the walls, one of which was a photograph from a camping trip where he was looking at someone he'd loved and hadn't known how to keep. He kept it on the wall not as punishment and not as sentimentality, but as a reminder of something he considered important, that the capacity for genuine attention had always been in him, that it had been there in that photograph, turned towards someone who deserved it, that losing everything he'd built on top of it had not created that capacity. It had only cleared away what was covering it. There was a lesson in that. He was careful not to make it too clean, because clean lessons were almost always false ones. The truth was messier, that people could change, but change was not redemption, and redemption was not reunion, and sometimes the best ending available to you was not the one you would have written for yourself at 32, but the one that was actually, honestly, yours. Some mornings he sat at the desk before work and listened to the street wake up below. The grocery owner rolling up the metal shutter, the first bus of the day. The particular quality of light at 7 in the morning in October when it came low and golden through the window and made even the concrete wall outside look briefly like something worth painting. And he thought about a middle school art teacher telling a 12-year-old that the painting was more interesting with the history in it, all the layers underneath, all the decisions you could see if you looked. He was looking now. It had cost him everything to learn how, and he would spend the rest of his life deciding that it was worth it. Not because the cost was fair, but because the alternative was continuing to be a man who looked at the people in front of him and saw only what they were worth to him. That man had a corner office and a view of the water, and a marriage to a woman he hadn't understood and hadn't tried to, and he had thrown all of it away for a version of success that turned out to be mostly a reflection. This man had a lopsided coffee table and a job that mattered, and the specific, unspectacular, irreplaceable knowledge that the people who sat across from him at that desk left better equipped to face their lives than when they walked in. It wasn't the empire he'd planned. It was, in the end, the only thing he'd ever built that he was proud of.